There's a moment, and I think every soldier knows this moment, when your body moves before your brain gives the order. You don't think, you don't calculate the odds, you don't ask who's watching or what the consequences are. You just move. I moved on a Tuesday. At least that's what the ship's calendar said. Tuesday. Which is a funny thing to remember because Tuesdays back home meant my mother making lentil soup and the neighbor's dog barking at absolutely nothing for 45 minutes. Tuesdays were supposed to be boring. This one wasn't. My name is Sergeant Dario Vasquez, and I have been stationed on the Varen neutral platform, what most of the crew just calls the shelf, for about 11 months. The shelf is a transit hub. Think of it like a rest stop on the galaxy's longest highway. Ships dock, crews resupply, diplomats argue in rooms that smell like recycled oxygen, and soldiers like me stand around trying to look useful while not accidentally starting an interstellar incident. I'm not being dramatic. That last part is literally in the mission briefing. Do not accidentally start an interstellar incident, in bold, underlined. The shelf is massive, about 3 kilometers end to end, built in layers like a cake nobody wanted to eat. The lower decks are cargo and fuel storage, smelling like hydraulic fluid, and something I can only describe as wet copper. The middle decks are the transit lanes, wide open corridors where a dozen species brush past each other every minute without making eye contact. The upper decks are diplomatic quarters and medical bays, quieter, better lit, air that actually tastes like air. I worked the middle decks. There were 4 of us on the human security detail at any given time. Me, Corporal Yemi Osai from Lagos, Private First Class Danny Reyes, who had been trying to transfer to a combat posting for 8 straight months, and Staff Sergeant Bryn Hollies, who had been on the shelf so long she claimed she could tell which species was approaching by the sound of their footsteps alone. Honestly, she probably could. We weren't combat soldiers exactly. We were presence soldiers. We were there to show that Earth had a hand in the shelf security consortium, that humanity was a partner in keeping this particular corner of neutral space functional. We carried weapons, pulse sidearms, but we hadn't fired them in months. The Varen security drones handled most of the actual enforcement. We were, essentially, uniforms with heartbeats. Which suited me fine. I had done 4 years of actual combat deployment before this posting. 2 years on the Outer Rim patrol ships, 1 year on the surface of Kale IV during the insurgency, and 1 year I don't talk about. The shelf was peaceful. The shelf was boring in the best possible way. I was 31 years old and I was starting to understand what my father meant when he said a man should choose quiet over glory every chance he gets. I was choosing quiet. Right up until the moment I couldn't anymore. The day started like every other day on the shelf starts, with the arrival cycle. Every 6 standard hours, a new wave of ships docks, and the middle decks fill with travelers, crew members, refugees, traders, and diplomatic envoys moving through in controlled currents. The Varen transit system runs it beautifully, color-coded pathways projected on the floor, automated announcement systems in 47 languages, drone escorts for high-priority travelers. The whole thing is choreographed like a symphony, most of the time. I was positioned at Junction 7, which is one of the main crossover points between the eastern docking arms and the central corridor. My job was simple: stand here, look authoritative, and make sure nobody was using the emergency exits as shortcuts. This happened more than you'd think. Mostly traders trying to shave time off their transit. The morning flow had been normal. A Korathi merchant caravan, big reptilian beings, 7 feet tall, smelling like dried spice, had passed through in an orderly cluster. A group of yelly students, barely a meter high, translucent skin flickering with nervous excitement, had clustered around a transit map trying to figure out the connection to the upper educational decks. A Delvani family, 3 adults and what I assumed was a child. Though with Delvani you genuinely can't tell, had stopped 3 feet from me to have what sounded like an argument conducted entirely in subsonic rumbles. I gave them space. Then the second docking wave started coming through. I heard it before I saw it, not the footsteps, the quality of sound. This particular section of the middle deck has a sort of acoustic property where you can sense when a crowd is moving differently than normal, when the flow changes direction, when pace shifts, when people are moving around something rather than with it. It's subtle. After 11 months, I'd learned to notice it. The crowd to my left was bending. People were giving a wide berth to something coming through the eastern corridor. Not panic, nobody was running, but that instinctive drift you get when something feels wrong, and every creature with a survival instinct decides to create distance without knowing quite why. I turned. There was a figure moving through the corridor, and she was moving badly. She was Kalhari. I recognized the physiology immediately because there was a full Kalhari diplomatic team on the upper decks, and I'd been briefed on the species. Bipedal, roughly human in proportion, but taller, maybe 6'3", with skin that shifted in undertones between deep indigo and slate gray depending on the light. 4 eyes arranged in a slight arc across a flat, angular face, each one independently mobile. Their hands had 6 fingers each, and Kalhari wore their rank and affiliation in the coloring of their secondary membrane, the thin ridge of tissue that ran along the jaw and down the neck, which could flush with pigment the way a human face can flush with emotion. This one secondary membrane was pale, almost white, which I would later learn meant she was in shock. She was wearing what I would come to recognize as Kalhari military dress, not armor but the equivalent of officers' utility clothing, dark material with stiffened shoulder panels and a rank designation embossed at the collar. The material was torn at her left side. I could see from 20 feet away that the tear wasn't clean. It wasn't wear or manufacturing defect. It was impact damage. Something had hit her, or she had hit something very hard, and the suit had failed to protect that section of her torso. She was holding her left side with her right hand, and the hand was dark with something wet. She was bleeding. Her gait was wrong, the controlled, deliberate movement of someone using every ounce of concentration to stay upright. 3 steps, pause. 3 steps, pause. Her eyes, all 4 of them, were scanning in different directions simultaneously, the way prey animals scan for threats. But there was no prey animal quality to the rest of her. Her jaw was set. Her other hand, her left, was still extended slightly to her side, not for balance, but in the specific position of someone who has spent so long carrying a weapon that the hand remains ready even when the weapon is gone. She had been armed, she wasn't anymore, but her hand still remembered. I started moving before I knew I was moving. 12 seconds. That's how long it takes me to close 20 feet in a crowd. She saw me coming. All 4 eyes tracked me before I was halfway there. She processed the uniform, the trajectory, my face, and she made a decision. I watched her make it. Her jaw shifted. Something in the angle of her shoulders changed. She was deciding whether I was a threat or something else, and she was doing it in real time with a torn side and blood on her hand, and whatever else she had been through in the last however many hours. She decided I wasn't a threat. She didn't stop moving. She didn't ask for help. She just accepted that I was coming and kept walking, as if the act of needing assistance was something she would deal with but hadn't made peace with yet. I reached her and matched her pace. "Hey," I said, which is not a medically impressive opening line. "You're hurt." She glanced at me sideways, one of the right side eyes, the one with the amber iris. "Observation confirmed," she said. Her voice was lower than I expected, slightly resonant, the words precise with only a trace of the harmonic doubling that Kalhari speech usually carried. She spoke good standard, better than good. "Can you tell me what happened?" "No." "Are you heading to medical?" A pause, 3 more steps. "Medical on this platform is compromised." That stopped me for half a second. Compromised how? I do not know who has been positioned there. I do not yet know the extent of the operation. I didn't fully understand that sentence. Not then. I filed it under she's been through something bad and isn't thinking clearly and kept walking with her. Okay, I said. Can I help you stay upright? She looked at me again. This time 2 eyes, the full frontal pair, considering, you are Earth Security Detail. Sergeant Vasquez, yes. Earth is not a party to my situation. No, I agreed, but you're bleeding on my floor. Something shifted in her expression. I still don't know what it was. Kalahari faces don't map to human expressions in a one-to-one way, but something changed. It might have been the closest thing she had to a reluctant almost smile. I'll never know for sure. She said, your assistance is acceptable. I got my arm around her right side, careful, not grabbing, just present, and we walked. I want to stop here and tell you something that I've thought about a lot in the months since this happened. At this point, I knew the following things. She was Kalahari, she was military, she was injured, and she was worried about something she wasn't telling me. I did not know her name. I did not know her rank. I did not know anything about who she was beyond what I could observe in the 2 minutes since I'd started walking with her. And honestly, none of that mattered to me in the moment. She was hurt, she needed help. That was the whole equation. I think about what she must have seen from her side of it. Some human soldier she'd never met, not even from her own species alliance. No political reason to help her, no order telling him to, just walking up and offering his arm like it was the most natural thing in the world. I wonder what that looked like to her. I wonder if it meant anything, or if she filed it under humans are strange and unpredictable and moved on. I think about it, I'll come back to it. There's a secondary medical facility on the shelf that most travelers don't know about. It's not on the transit maps. It was built into the station's original design as a contingency space, overflow in case of mass casualty events, and it had been repurposed over the years into what Bren Hollies called the quiet room. Basic med equipment, a Varen medical drone on standby, and nobody from any particular diplomatic delegation watching the door. Bren knew about it because Bren knew about everything. I called her on cams as we walked. Bren, secondary med bay. I need it open and the drone prepped. A beat of silence. You starting incidents without me, Vasquez? Negative, just get the room ready. On it. Also, you should know the eastern docking arm just logged an irregular departure. A ship pulled out without clearance processing. The Varen Dock Authority is making noise about it. Copy, deal with that, room first. Copy, Sergeant. I clicked off. My passenger. I was already thinking of her that way, my passenger, like she was something I was responsible for, had heard every word of that exchange. I felt her shift slightly, the muscles along her right side changing their tension. Irregular departure, she said. Probably nothing. No, quiet, flat, certain, not nothing. We turned the corner to the secondary med bay corridor. The door was already open, the medical drone status lights blinking pale blue, standby mode ready. Bren had been fast. I got my passenger to the main bed, calling it a bed is generous. It was more like a padded examination platform with adjustable height rails, and she sat down. Or rather, she performed the act of sitting down while clearly not allowing herself to simply fall, which is what her body wanted to do. The control was extraordinary. Even now, even like this, she was deciding every movement. I'm going to call the Varen medical system, I said. Standard. No. I stopped. No Varen medical system. No formal record of this treatment. I looked at her. Her secondary membrane was still pale, but I could see color starting to creep back in at the edges, deep violet, moving slowly inward. The drone had already scanned her, and I could see on its display panel that the wound was significant but not critical. Structural damage to the outer layer of her torso wall, significant fluid loss, some secondary contusion from what looked like impact against a hard surface. Painful, serious, not immediately fatal. "You're going to be okay," I said. She looked at me with the pair of eyes that sat higher on her face, the secondary pair, which I'd read could perceive in different spectra than the primary. "You are certain of this?" Medical drone agrees with me. "You've lost fluid, but you're stable. The wound needs sealing and rest." "Rest is not possible. Right now, nothing is possible except letting this drone seal your side. After that, we can talk about whatever you're not telling me." A long pause, the kind of pause that is wait. Then acceptable. 40 minutes. That's how long the drone worked on her. I stayed in the room, partially because she hadn't told me to leave and partially because I felt, in some way I couldn't articulate, that leaving wasn't the right thing to do. She didn't make a sound during the treatment. Not once. The sealing process is uncomfortable by human standards. The Varan medical system uses a localized field to knit tissue at an accelerated rate, which causes what patients describe as a deep heat and a pulling sensation. In my one experience with it, I had said a very loud word that I'm not going to repeat here. She sat completely still and breathed. Just breathed. I stood near the door, not watching her, that felt intrusive, but aware of her, listening. About 20 minutes in, she spoke. "Why are you still here?" Not a question, more of an observation. "Making sure you're okay," I said. "I am not your responsibility. You became my responsibility when you were bleeding in my corridor." Silence, then your corridor. "Junction 7. I've been standing there for 11 months. I'm pretty attached to it." I thought I heard something that might, in a very technical sense, have been a short exhale of something like amusement. I wasn't certain. I wasn't going to claim certainty. "Vasquez," she said. "Sergeant Vasquez, yes. You are strange for a soldier." "I've been told." Most soldiers, when they encounter a situation they do not understand, either escalate or withdraw. You did neither. I thought about that. Seemed like escalating or withdrawing would have left you on the floor. "Yes," she said, "it would have." Another silence, more comfortable than the previous ones somehow. "My name," she said, and she spoke the Kalahari version first, something I couldn't reproduce with human vocal architecture, all harmonics and registers, "in your language is closest to Rail. You may use that." "Rail," I repeated. "Yes." "What happened to you, Rail?" The drone beeped twice, completion signal. The wound was sealed. She looked down at her side, pressed 2 fingers carefully against the treated area, and appeared to find the result satisfactory. Then she looked at me. All 4 eyes, the full assessment. "What I am going to tell you," she said slowly, "will complicate your life significantly." I had come from a combat deployment. I had done KLIV. I had done the year I don't talk about. I had watched things I still see sometimes when I close my eyes too fast in the dark. "Try me," I said. She told me in pieces. Not because she was confused, but because she was choosing what to tell me carefully, like someone placing objects on a surface with deliberate intent. She knew exactly what she was saying and exactly in what order, and I had the sense that if I'd interrupted to ask questions, the sequence would have been disrupted in ways that mattered to her. So I listened. She was, and this is where the floor under my understanding of the situation started to shift, not a Kalahari diplomatic officer. She was not, in fact, part of any diplomatic apparatus at all. The Kalahari had 3 branches of institutional authority: the Civic Council, which governed the homeworld systems; the Trade Convocation, which managed economic relations and interspecies commerce; and the Vale Karath. The Vale Karath was the 3rd branch. It had no direct human language equivalent. The closest I could get, translating her explanation, was something like the instrument of final certainty. It was the Kalahari military security apparatus, not just an army, but the intelligence arm, the enforcement arm, the crisis response mechanism, the thing the Kalahari deployed when the other options had already failed. The Vale Karath had 12 formations. The 12th formation, she paused before she said its name, not from reverence but from something more complicated, was called the Vithari Choir. She translated it for me slowly, because she wanted me to understand the precise meaning. Those who arrive when all other songs have ended. In practice, the Vithari Choir was the formation that operated in conditions where conventional military response was either impossible or had already failed. They went into places after the crisis had become catastrophic. They went in when other formations couldn't. They handled situations that had no diplomatic solution, no negotiated exit, no clean outcome available. They were the last option, the final instrument. They had never lost an operation. Not once, in 93 standard years of existence. Their commanding officer held a designation that translated roughly as the architect of endings. A title that, she explained carefully, was not metaphorical. The architect was responsible for designing, authorizing, and personally overseeing every operation the Vithari Choir conducted. Who holds that title? I asked, because I was following the logic but I hadn't arrived at the end of it yet. She looked at me steadily. All four eyes. I do, she said. I want to tell you that I responded with something composed and professional. I did not. What I said was, no. She waited. You're the commanding officer of the Vithari Choir, yes. The Kalahari military formation that has never lost an operation. Correct. And you were walking through Junction 7 bleeding. Yes. I sat down on the secondary stool near the medical drone because I felt like standing might require more balance than I currently had available. What happened? I asked, and this time the question was different, not the casual version from before, the full version, what happened? She took a breath, a Kalahari breath, slower than a human one, the ribcage expanding in a slightly different sequence, and then she told me. Rael had been on the shelf for 6 days before I found her. Not as a traveler, not as a diplomat, the Vithari Choir did not announce itself. That was one of their foundational operational principles. They were not visible until the moment they needed to be, and by then, the visibility served the operation rather than compromising it. She had been here because the shelf had a problem. An entity, she used the Kalahari word, which translated loosely as a canker in the transit, meaning something that had embedded itself in the infrastructure and was feeding on it, had established operation on the shelf approximately 4 months prior. Not a single individual, a network. 23 individuals from 7 different species, using the shelf's position as a neutral transit hub to run operations that violated the neutral compact on 6 separate counts, including weapons brokering, intelligence trafficking, and the movement of beings who were not traveling willingly. The Varen Shelf Administration knew something was wrong. They had flagged anomalies in transit records, in cargo manifests, in the financial flow of certain commercial entities registered to the platform. But the compact meant they couldn't act unilaterally. Any enforcement action required consensus from the security consortium, which the embedded network had been slowly, methodically compromising. 3 of the 5 members of the Shelf Security Consortium had representatives who had been bought, blackmailed, or replaced. The Varen administration couldn't trust their own oversight structure, so they had done something unusual. They had quietly, through channels so obscure I still don't fully understand how it worked, contacted the Vale Karath. The Vithari Choir was not an announced response force. They were a ghost, Rail had come to the shelf alone. She had a team, but they had entered separately, over days, through different docking arms under different identities. 11 operatives. And for 6 days they had been quietly mapping the network, identifying every node, establishing the full picture before acting. The operation should have taken another 3 days. It didn't. Someone, she didn't know who yet, which was the problem, the part that was still dangerous, had identified one of her operatives. Not her. One of her team. And instead of running or reporting or trying to buy the operative, they had done something that demonstrated genuine tactical intelligence. They had used the identification as a signal, not an alarm to flee, but a trigger for immediate acceleration. Within 4 hours of her operative being burned, the network began collapsing into evacuation mode. People moved. Evidence was sanitized. The ship that had left the eastern docking arm without clearance was carrying at least 3 of the network's leadership tier. Rail's team had engaged. Not all of them were okay. She said this the way you say something when you're not going to say more about it. Not flat, not without emotion, but contained, sealed. The way someone talks about a cost they've already decided to pay and don't need to be told they're allowed to grieve. She said, the engagement was messy. I was separated from my team by 3 corridors and 2 security bulkheads. The path back to the upper decks through the conventional routes was compromised. I used the maintenance corridor system on level 4, which involves some structural irregularities. A pause. I encountered one of them. One of the network. Yes, the engagement was brief. I was not entirely unaffected. The wound in her side, the maintenance corridor, brief engagement. I was building the picture. How did you end up in Junction 7? I asked. It was the convergence point for 3 maintenance corridors and the most direct path to the eastern transit lanes, while avoiding the compromised sections. I calculated it would be low surveillance density at the current transit cycle timing. It is, I said. I've been telling Bren we need another camera angle there for months. She looked at me. Your recommendation has merit. Yeah, that's great, but why didn't you call your team? Communications are partially compromised, short range only. My team is running their assignments. I was completing mine. What was yours? A beat. Getting out of the maintenance corridors without collapsing, reaching a secure location, and re-establishing a command picture. You were doing your job. I am always doing my job. There was something in how she said that, not arrogance. It wasn't the sound of someone who thought they were better than the circumstances. It was something quieter and more fundamental, the sound of someone for whom the work was not separate from who they were. The job and the person were not different things. She didn't do the work. She was the work. I had met people like that before, not many, but a few. My father was one of them. I understood that sound. What do you need right now? I asked. She seemed to appreciate the directness of that. No preamble, no processing out loud. Just the practical question. 3 things, she said. First, a secure short-range communication node I can use to reach my remaining operatives without being traced through the platform's main systems. Second, access to the shelf's transit departure logs for the last 6 hours. Third, she stopped. Third, confirmation of which human personnel on this platform have not been compromised. I absorbed that. You're including us in the trust calculation, I said. I am including everyone in the trust calculation. But you told me. I told you, she agreed, after 6 minutes of direct observation and assessment. You carried someone bleeding in a public corridor without hesitation, without calculating advantage, without taking any action that suggested interest in what you were carrying or who I might be. You called for a secure room rather than a logged medical response. You did not contact your superiors immediately upon my first unusual statement. She paused. And you brought me to a room that isn't on the transit maps. She had noted all of that. Of course she had. I'm cleared, I said, and I'd put Bren Hollies' name down before my own. Yemi Osai, yes. Danny Ray's, I'd trust her, but she talks too much. You should know that. Something shifted in her secondary membrane, a flicker of color. I was fairly sure that was Kalhari for. This human is something I didn't fully predict. The communication node, I said, standing up. I might be able to help with that. What followed was 3 hours that I would later describe in my official report as support operations in response to a developing security situation on the neutral platform, which is technically accurate and describes approximately 4% of what actually happened. The real version. Bren Hollies, who I had called without fully briefing on the situation, showed up to the secondary med bay, took one look at Rail sitting on the medical platform in damaged military dress with a sealed wound and all 4 eyes running simultaneous assessments of the room, and said, "All right, what are we doing?" When I explained a version of it, the relevant parts, Bren was quiet for approximately 4 seconds. Then she said, "Right. I've got a maintenance access terminal on level 3 that uses the cargo network instead of the transit network. Different routing. The platform's main system can't see traffic on it unless someone specifically knows to look, and nobody's going to look at cargo routing during an active transit cycle." Rail looked at Bren the way she'd looked at me in Junction 7. Assessment. Calculation. "You knew about this terminal already," Rail said. "I know about every room in the station," Bren said simply. "For what purpose?" Bren shrugged, very slightly. "Same reason a good soldier knows every exit in every room they ever walk into. Because the day you need it and don't know it is the day it matters." Another flicker in Rail's membrane, stronger this time. "Your personnel are unusual," she said to me. "I keep trying to tell the command structure that," I said. "They don't appreciate us." We moved. Rail was on her feet. She refused the support this time, moving carefully but under her own power, which told me the drone's treatment had made a significant difference. She walked slightly behind Bren and I, observing, always observing. I got the sense she was still running operational assessment on both of us in real time, updating her picture. The cargo terminal on level 3 was, as Bren had described, a maintenance access point that predated the current platform management system by about 20 years. It was built into the wall behind a rack of atmospheric processing equipment, hidden not deliberately but effectively. You had to know to move the secondary filter array to reach the interface panel. Bren moved the filter array like she'd done it 100 times. Maybe she had. Rail connected to the terminal using a small device she removed from a sealed compartment in her suit, a piece of Kalhari technology I hadn't seen before, flat and dark, that interfaced with the shelf's cargo network in a way I didn't fully understand. She worked for 11 minutes. I stood behind her and watched the corridor. Bren stood the other side and did the same. Nobody came. When Rail stopped working, she stood still for a moment, processing. Then, 4 of my operatives are confirmed active. 2 are completing objectives. 1 is pinned in Section 12, lower deck. I need a path out for her. 1 is, a pause that held something heavy in it, not responding. "The one who isn't responding," I said carefully, "do you need?" "I need the path for Section 12 first." Flat, deliberate. "Her name is Vithais. She has been running interference on the network's communication suppression, and she has been doing it for 4 hours in a confined space, and she needs a corridor cleared to the upper docks." "Lower deck Section 12, Bren said. "That's cargo processing. During active transit cycle, there are 12 active Veyron drone patrols in that zone." "I know," Rail said. "The drones are not the problem. The problem is the 2 network operatives who have used the transit cycle as cover to establish a position at the maintenance junction." "Covering the exit," I said. "Covering the exit." We looked at each other, me and Bren. in the way that partners look at each other when they are about to agree to do something that is technically outside their assignment parameters. We're Security Consortium, I said. We have jurisdiction on this platform. We'd need a documented inciting incident, Bren said. The network operative I engaged in the maintenance corridor, Rail said. I can provide you the coordinates of what remains of that encounter. That would constitute physical evidence of hostile action on platform grounds, which falls within Consortium Enforcement Authority. That works, Bren said immediately. We were technically the Security Consortium. We were technically authorized. Some parts of the subsequent operation were very technical. I'll give you the shape of what happened without the full blow-by-blow, because some of it is still under interdepartmental review, and some of it I'm not fully certain I'm allowed to detail. Here is the shape. Bren went to retrieve the evidence coordinates Rail had given us, with Yemi Osai as backup. They were moving in official security capacity, and they had the documentation to support it. I stayed with Rail. Not because she needed a babysitter. She was the commanding officer of the Vithari Choir. She did not need a babysitter. I stayed because the secondary med bay was in my patrol area, and if anyone came looking for why an unusual energy signature was coming from the cargo network terminal on level 3, my presence in the adjacent corridor had an explanation. Also, if I'm being honest, I wasn't ready to walk away from this situation yet. We waited. It was the strangest 40 minutes of my time on the shelf. Rail sat on the medical platform, not resting exactly. There was nothing restful about her stillness, but conserving energy with a deliberateness that was itself a kind of discipline. I stood near the door, running the corridor audio through my earpiece. We talked. Not about the operation, there was nothing useful to add during the waiting phase. We talked about other things, small things. She asked about Earth-Sun. Not in a scientific way, she knew the science, but the way you ask about something when you want to understand how it feels to someone who grew up under it. I told her about the light in the late afternoon in the town where I grew up. The way it comes in at an angle and makes everything look slightly golden and slightly sad at the same time. The way my father used to sit on the back step in that light and say nothing, and how that had seemed profound to me as a child and still did. She was quiet for a moment after that. The Kalahari have a concept, she said. There is no precise translation. It describes the quality of light at the end of a thing, not darkness, but the illumination that arrives just before the dark. The kind that makes you aware of what you are looking at, precisely because it is almost gone. We call that golden hour, I said. It is a good name. What do you call it? She said the Kalahari word. I can't reproduce it, but I remembered the sound of it for a long time afterward. Why did you tell me? I asked. Back there when I asked what happened, you didn't have to. She considered this for a longer time than the question seemed to warrant. You were going to be involved regardless, she said finally. You had already made that choice by walking across Junction 7. The only variable was whether you would be involved with information or without it. A pause. I have learned that people who act without information make errors. People who act with it can be useful. So you told me because I'd already decided to help. I told you, she said, because I assessed that you had earned it. I didn't have a response to that. I didn't think one was needed. Bren's voice came through the earpiece. Evidence secured. Consortium Enforcement Authority activated. We're heading to Section 12 lower. Yemi's running point. Danny's joining from the east side. Yes, I told Danny. Don't look at me like that through the comms. I'm not looking at anything, I said. I can hear your face, Vasquez. I clicked off. Your team, Rail said. Yeah. They are acting outside their standard parameters. They're acting inside their own standard parameters, I said. which are somewhat different from what the briefing documents describe. She made the sound again, the sound that might have been something like amusement. "Will they be safe?" she asked, and the question surprised me not because it was personal but because of how it was asked, not as a tactical query, as a genuine question. She wanted to know if they were going to be okay. "They're good soldiers," I said, "and Bren Hollies has been alive long enough that I think the universe just accepts that she's going to keep being alive. A useful quality. She's an unusual person." "Yes," Rail said, "I noticed." 40 seconds of silence. Then Bren's voice. "Section 12 clear. The two network operatives are in consortium custody. Vthis is out." I watched Rail's secondary membrane when those words came through. The color change was immediate and visible, a deep, warm violet spreading from the jaw upward. Not performed, not controlled, just a real physical response that happened before she could decide whether to let it happen. Relief. She was relieved. The commanding officer of the Vithari choir, the woman who had walked through a maintenance corridor with a torn side and blood on her hand, without making a sound, who had sat through medical treatment without flinching, who had spoken to me about evidence and trust and operational parameters with the composed precision of someone who had been doing this for decades. She was relieved. Because her person was safe. I looked away. It felt like the right thing to do, give her that moment without an audience. "Good," I said to my boots. "Yes," she said, to the space in front of her. The next few hours were operational. Rail made contact with her remaining active team members through Bren's cargo terminal. The two operatives completing objectives finished them. The network's physical presence on the shelf was dismantled with a thoroughness that I would only understand later, reading the post-incident report that Rail's team provided to the Varen administration. 11 network members were in custody, some through Vithari choir action, 3 through Consortium Enforcement Authority, one who had apparently made the decision to surrender upon discovering that the exit routes had all closed simultaneously. The departed ship, the one that had left without clearance, was a problem. It was outside the shelf's jurisdiction. But Rail, working from the cargo terminal, had filed a transit alert through a channel I didn't know existed, and by the time that ship had reached the nearest relay point, it had encountered what the official documentation would describe as a routine Kalahari naval patrol, which it was not. Which it absolutely was not. But the documentation would describe it that way. The fourth operative who had stopped responding, I found out at the end of the day. She was alive. She had been injured and had used a standard Vithari protocol for radio silence when injured, which was apparently standard procedure, which apparently every member of that formation knew about so that the commanding officer would not receive a non-responsive signal and act on it with incomplete information. The formation takes care of its commanding officers, decision-making even when it can't take care of itself. Think about the design philosophy behind that. I did. She was okay. She was extracted. She would need real medical attention, not the secondary base drone, but she was going to be okay. When Rail received that confirmation, she didn't show anything visible on her face or in her membrane. She went still for a moment, and then she continued working. But I was watching and I saw her hands. For a moment, just a moment, her left hand closed into a fist and pressed against her own chest. The oldest gesture in the world. Some version of it exists in every species I've ever read about. The hand to the heart. The thing you do when something that was unbearable has resolved into something bearable, and your body needs a moment to register the shift. She let her hand open. She kept working. It was late in the station cycle. The shelf's artificial lighting had shifted to the dimmer nighttime setting, when the situation was, as Rail put it, sufficiently contained. She said it standing in Bren's cargo terminal alcove, Looking at the interface panel, her team confirmed, the network dismantled, the situation resolved. Her side still had the sealed wound. She had been operating for over 16 hours by this point, possibly more if you counted the day before. She looked tired, not compromised. Nothing about her function seemed compromised, but tired in the way that has accumulated rather than arrived suddenly. She turned and looked at me. "Sergeant Vasquez," she said. "Still here," I said. "I am aware." A pause. "I want to acknowledge what you and your team did today." I shook my head. "We did our jobs." "No," she said, and she said it with a kind of gentle firmness that didn't leave room for deflection. "You made a choice in Junction 7 that was not required by your assignment. You made several subsequent choices that were not required. You involved people you trusted, and that trust was well placed, and the operation's outcome was shaped by those choices." She held my gaze. "I have been doing this work for a long time. The outcome of operations depends on variables. Some variables can be planned for, some cannot. You were a variable that could not have been planned for." "Is that a compliment?" I asked. "Yes," she said, "that is a compliment." I nodded slowly. There was something I needed to say, and I wasn't entirely sure how to say it, but I'd been thinking about it since she'd told me who she was. "The thing I keep thinking about," I said, "is that it didn't matter who you were. It didn't change anything about the decision." "No," she agreed. "It didn't. You made the decision before you knew." "I want to be clear about that." "I am clear about it." Her secondary membrane flushed just briefly, just at the edges. "I am very clear about it." We stood there for a moment. Two people on a space station at the end of a long day that had been several different kinds of extraordinary. "What happens now?" I asked. "My team departs through separate channels over the next 20 standard hours. The Varen administration will receive a full operational report through the appropriate channels. The consortium enforcement actions your team took are fully documented and supported." A pause. "There will be no official record of this room." "Of course not. And the network's presence on this platform is ended." She looked at me steadily. "The people who were being moved through here, there are 43 individuals in transit records who were not traveling willingly. They will be found." That hit harder than anything else she'd said all day. "Good," I said. The word felt small. "Yes," she said, "good." She left the secondary med bay before the morning cycle. I didn't watch her go, she didn't want watching, and I understood that. She said one more thing before she went. She said, "I will remember Junction 7. And then she was gone, moving through the corridor with that controlled, deliberate walk. And if you hadn't known what she'd come from and what she'd done and who she was, you might have looked at her and thought she was just another traveler heading for the docking arm. Just another person passing through. The post-incident documentation took 3 weeks and involved 4 separate reviewing bodies, 2 of which Bren and I weren't allowed to know the names of. The Varen administration expressed formal appreciation for the consortium security team's actions in neutralizing a network operating in violation of the Neutral Compact. There was a commendation. There was a formal note in our service records. Danny Reyes, who had been wanting a transfer to a combat posting for 8 months, stopped putting in the transfer requests afterward. I asked her about it once quietly, and she said, "I think I had the wrong definition of what mattered." I didn't ask her to explain that. I understood it. Yemi Osai was quiet for several days after the operation. Then one morning he came in and he was himself again, and he never talked about it, and that was fine. Bren Hollies submitted a formal recommendation through the consortium security channel that Junction 7 needed additional camera angles. It was approved within a week. I stood at Junction 7 the day after the approval came through and watched the installation team put up the new cameras and thought about Rail looking at the space and saying, "Your recommendation has merit." I got a message 4 months later. It came through the cargo network routing, not the transit system, the cargo network. It was text only, no identifier, no signature. It said the 43 have been found, all 43. And underneath that, one more line. One line in what I recognized, from the sound she had made when she taught it to me, as Kalhari script. I took it to a translation resource. It took 3 hours to find a system that could handle the script accurately. The translation was, the light that arrives before the dark given freely changes what the dark finds.